Welcome to The Reality Taboo. It is March 15th, 2024. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness. This week's episode is going to be a potpourri mixture of various topics.
We'll jump right in with a big black pill. 4 years after the COVIDian nightmare, we have a retrospective. The Economist, YouGov did some polling a little over a week ago, asking respondents in retrospect if they thought several different ostensibly anti-COVID measures, they thought they were the right decision or the wrong decision. And this is not at the time. This is given what we know now, given 4 years of information and additional research and differences in outcomes by countries and by states. And with everything that we know today, the first question is, was it the right decision to mandate that masks be worn indoors? And at this point, 4 years after COVID came and is gone, and effectively everyone is living their lives as if it was never here, or almost everybody is, we have 63% of respondents saying, yes, it was the right decision to mandate masks, and only 29% saying that it was not. This is with no evidence. There's no evidence at all that masks do anything to stop the spread of any sort of respiratory illness. And COVID famously was something that older people with comorbidities are more at risk of than younger, healthier people are. Despite this, for those under the age of 30, some 73% of respondents say that it was the right decision, compared to just 14% who said it was the wrong decision. While among those 65 and over, it's much closer, with just 53%, still a majority, but not an overwhelming one, saying that wearing masks was the right decision, mandating masks was the right decision, whereas just 41% say that it was not. There's a huge partisan divide here. 95% of Biden voters believe that mandating masks was the right decision, whereas just 3% of Biden voters think it was the wrong decision. And with polling like this, that is with transcription errors and garbled questions and things like that, that is effectively a rate of 0%. That's statistically within the margin of error of 0%. So if you are supporting Biden now, it is statistically highly, highly improbable that you are skeptical at all of the anti-COVID measures that were rolled out 4 years ago. And even though Donald Trump continues to self-congratulate himself for Operation Warp Speed and for the measures that his administration instituted during the first year of COVID, just 26% of Trump voters believe that that mandating masks was the right decision, whereas 64% think it was the wrong decision. So among Biden voters, it's 99-1 almost, or 95-3 believe that it was the right decision. Among Trump supporters, however, 2-1 Trump supporters believe that mandating masks indoor was the wrong decision.
And it's interesting to see how Trump will handle COVID once the campaign starts gearing up this summer and into the fall, because I remember one of the very few times it looked like Trump was genuinely taken off guard by the reaction of his supporters. He was at a rally and he was toting how successful Operation Warp Speed was and talking in positive terms about the vaccine, and his own supporters booed at him. So that'll be interesting to see how he handles that.
Yeah, historically he uses his rallies as an opportunity to crowd test his ideas, and he takes the enthusiasm or the lack thereof responses from the things that he says and calibrates his message accordingly. But this, at least the first instance I heard of that Jeff's referencing was several months, if not years ago, and still today it seems that it's virtually impossible for Trump to think that anything that he was in charge of or anything that he has done is wrong, whether he just totally lacks any sort of self-reflection or if he refuses to acknowledge it. Either way, publicly, he will not take any responsibility at all. And it seems like this may be one of those issues that he's just not going to calibrate on.
I want to play a clip of Anthony Fauci, who almost all Democrats relied on as basically infallible. Whatever he said about masks, about coronavirus, about COVID in general, was taken as gospel. Here's a clip of him from early March 2020.
There's a lot of confusion among people and misinformation surrounding face masks. Can you discuss that?
The masks are important for someone who's infected to prevent them from infecting someone else. Now, when you see people and look at the films in China and South Korea, whatever, everybody's wearing a mask. Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often, there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course. But when you think masks, you should think of healthcare providers needing them and people who are ill. The people who, when you look at the films of foreign countries and you see 85% of the people wearing masks, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not against it. If you want to do it, that's fine.
But it can lead to a shortage of masks.
Exactly. That's the point. It could lead to a shortage of masks for the people who really need it.
So just a few weeks after that, it was mandatory to wear masks in most places in the United States, and it was something that was essential that you had to do if you had any sort of concern for other people. So how fast things can change and how quickly people's opinions can change. And people heard that clip and then they were, okay, we don't have to wear masks. And then a few weeks later, Fauci said everybody needs to wear masks and everybody started wearing masks. So it's just, there's so many things you can say about COVID. One of them is just how fear can be harnessed, how much power you can grab by making people afraid. That was one of my biggest takeaways from COVID.
I don't disagree with that outright, but I think it needs a little bit of clarification. I think when we talk about fear, it's not so much fear of illness as it is fear of loss of status. And so early on, for the first month and a half, when the pandemic was, when cases were growing in the United States and the videos out of China were being shared far and wide, the high status position was to not freak out about it, to not make it a big deal. There was the implication that if you did, you were probably a little bit xenophobic and chauvinistic. And this was just another example of far right wingers being afraid of immigration, diseases, and that sort of thing, and how the other is unhealthy and dangerous. We had Nancy Pelosi famously telling people to go hug a Chinaman.
And around that same time, Trump wanted to have a travel ban with China. And of course, the reflexive response back then was, if Trump wants to do it, it must be bad. So banning people from China was, again, xenophobic.
And to fast forward 4 years later, one of the reasons that I feel confident in asserting that it wasn't fear in the way that it's traditionally perceived as like a biological threat to those who it could potentially affect, is that we have the numbers that we just reviewed from the polls, from the Economist poll 4 years after the fact, with majorities saying that it was the right decision to mandate masks and to force people to stay at home, to work, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, even though they say not just that it was the right decision at the time, but if it were to happen again today, it would be the right decision. While they do that, while they maintain that position, the uptake in the most recent boosters for the vaccine are extraordinarily low, and that if there was still genuine fear that COVID was a real health threat, then you would expect the numbers of uptake for the vaccine boosters to mirror or at least be similar to the overwhelming support for these really restrictive measures, but that isn't the case.
And if people really wanted to protect themselves from COVID, they would change their diet, they would exercise, they would do the things to boost their immune system that are able to be done by anyone at essentially no cost. And yet most people refuse to do that. So I don't know if what that says about their genuine fear level.
I think what it says is that we're correct, that they are not really worried about it from a health perspective, but they are worried about the status implications, which is why, even though uptake levels for boosters are low now, I believe it is because there is so little emphasis in the institutional power centers in obtaining those boosters. But if that changes and pressure again is put on people to do things like take the shot or put the masks back on or social distance or whatever the case might be, I think we'll snap back right to rates that were very similar to what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic.
And another negative aspect of the quote-unquote vaccines are that I think for a lot of people, once they got the vaccine, they felt like, oh, that's all I need. Well, that's how it was sold to them, that now you're safe. Now you don't need to do anything. This is going to stop the virus. And so it disincentivize people to, again, take the steps that really would make a difference in keeping them safe and boosting their immune system, eating well, getting exercise, getting outside, sleeping well. Those kinds of things are going to do so much more than getting a shot. I can just speak for myself, example of one. I've never had a booster. I've never had a vaccine for COVID, and I've never had COVID. And I attribute that because I lead a healthy lifestyle. But people, pharmaceutical companies, healthcare providers, they don't make money off people being healthy. And so there's an obvious business incentive for this system to be in place, for people to get vaccines. Pfizer obviously has had record profits.
Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry needs to sell you an immune system with planned obsolescence built into it. If you have your own immune system that functions well and is self-regulating and self-repairing, then there is no money or very little money in pharmaceuticals. The question about masks was one of the 6 questions that YouGov queried its respondents on. 4 of the other 5 had very similar responses. The question on whether closing non-essential businesses was the right or wrong decision, whether requiring people to social distance, mandating that they work from home where possible, and providing direct stimulus payments to citizens. Those numbers were very similar as to the responses that we reviewed with requiring people to wear masks indoors in public. There was one question that's probably the most controversial aspect of what was required during the COVIDian nightmare, and that was closing schools and forcing students to engage in remote learning. But even in that, the most controversial of the things that were mandated during COVID, there's still an outright majority at 51% of respondents who say it was the right decision, with just 36% of respondents saying it was the wrong decision. So even closing down schools and all of the consequences, the retardation in learning that caused so many students, just one in 3 Americans think that doing that was the wrong decision.
I would have liked to have seen data on the vaccine. That could be, I can think of a few questions. First, did you get the vaccine? Are you up to date on the recommended shots? What do you think about mandates? Is it justified that people lost their jobs, were fired for refusing to get the shot? Unfortunately, we don't have that data on this poll. But I remember when they were rolling out the vaccine, and one of the biggest propaganda pushes of anything I've seen in my lifetime, trying to convince everyone to get the shot. And there's that famous clip of Rachel Maddow saying that if you get the shot, the virus stops with you. It doesn't pass to the next person. And that's just shown obviously, unequivocally, to be a lie, because people got the shot and they still got COVID and they still passed it on to other people.
Touche. I suspect that the mandating of shots, although I guess that was never officially required across the country in the way, to the extent that masks being required or social distancing was required. Yeah, that was definitely the direction that the establishment was trying to take things and would have preferred to have taken things. And so I think almost definitionally, but the fact that that was ultimately where the final stand was and the pushback began, I think I would have to say that that is probably even more controversial than closing down schools. There is a question in this survey that we're referencing. It's a little more amorphous, less direct, but is somewhat related to the question of vaccines, and that is whether or not more should be done to ensure that the population is vaccinated. That one comes split pretty close to evenly, with 53% of respondents agreeing that more needs to be done to ensure vaccination, and 47% saying that nothing additionally needs to be done to ensure it.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to ask further questions on those people who say more needs to be done. What sort of measures would they be comfortable with? Because I just find that puzzling, given I don't have the number right in front of me, but it was around 20% of Americans. This was a few weeks ago. Around 20% of Americans had received the recommended booster shots that the CDC recommends. So I don't really know how to square those two things, and I don't know if people might think that. I guess it's understandable in some sense that they thought just getting the original 2 doses was enough, because that is how it was sold originally, that once you get these 2 shots, that's it. It's a one and done thing. Like the polio vaccine, for instance, when you get the vaccine and you're good to go for life. And it's crazy how much rewriting of history there is. You talk to people, and a lot of people now will pretend like the vaccine was never sold. They pretend like it was sold as, it was just something just like the flu vaccine. It's something that you're going to have to get once a year at least, and that it's not permanent protection. And that is absolutely not how it was being sold originally.
It's not just rewriting history, but it's rewriting contemporary definitions of words, which I guess in some sense is rewriting history. But traditionally, vaccines were perceived to be exactly what you talked about with polio. You get the vaccine and it gives you protection. It doesn't simply reduce the symptoms for a definite period of time before losing its effectiveness entirely, which is what we have now with these boosters, both in the case of the flu and also COVID-19, where these are not vaccines as traditionally understood. They do not provide anything close to absolute protection, and it wears off.
Yeah, the CDC even acknowledges that if you compare someone who got the COVID shots, whatever the time frame is that they say it's effective, 3-6 months. So you compare someone who got it 3 to 6 months ago to someone who never got the COVID vaccine. You compare those two people at the same time. Even the CDC will acknowledge they have the same level of protection
from the COVID vaccine, but that they're
from the virus. So again, just the numbers, around 20% of people being up to date on their COVID boosters, I find that perplexing. I'm surprised it's so low.
So low in the sense that just 1 in 5 people are up to date on their boosters, whereas over half of people think that more needs to be done to maintain vaccination rates.
Yes, I find those two things hard to reconcile.
I think the explanation is largely in the fact that while the CDC may recommend that X number of boosters, a certain booster regime be followed, it's not getting anything like the attention that it did 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And so the status implications just aren't what they were at the time. I wonder what percentage of Americans who are broadly on board with the COVIDian measures and the COVIDian response up to current time are aware of the fact that they are supposed to still be receiving boosters. I suspect based on the fact that just 1 in 5 have received them, whereas more than 1 in 2 believe that they should have received them and that more should be done to ensure that everyone else receives them, leads me to believe that most people are probably unaware of the fact that they're supposed to receive those boosters now. The real test to that assessment will be if something like the pandemic crops up again. We'll see if we get response rates in terms of actions taken that resemble the rates of uptake when the vaccine was first rolled out, or if it will just manifest itself in polling data but not be backed up by actions. I suspect that if the push from the status shaping institutions is for people to get those boosters and get back in line and get them every 3 months, and that there's a lot of pressure put on people to do that, that they will return to the vaccine regime.
All right, you're listening to The Reality Taboo. Time for our next topic. What you got for us, Ness?
We'll dip into the well that we can keep dipping into at least through the rest of this calendar year. Let's talk about the presidential election. I'm going to hedge my bets a little bit and put here that I am less certain than I had been in the past that Trump will not be permitted to win in 2024. I think we are potentially entering a situation where the international pressure on the United States and on Israel to stop what is happening in Gaza could leak into domestic politics in a significant enough way that we could have powerful institutions, powerful lobbies like the ADL and AIPAC holding their noses and ensuring that Trump wins the presidency in 2024 if it is perceived that Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and the Democratic power structure has waffled sufficiently on the question of supporting unconditionally Israel, as much as the like AIPAC and the ADL is allergic to MAGA republicanism and despises Donald Trump. If it comes down to supporting Trump and giving or maintaining Israel's blank check versus potentially undercutting Trump and giving power to a Biden administration that is waffling on that blank check and is not just rhetorically talking about restricting what Israel is able to do, but actually put some teeth into that. And
yeah, and I think you see that just today or yesterday, Chuck Schumer made a public statement in Congress saying that, or on the Senate floor, saying that essentially Netanyahu needs to go. Israel needs new leadership. So Schumer, the self-described guardian of Israel, is apparently turning on the leader. And it's the first time, I may have missed other statements, but it's the first time I've seen certainly a major supporter of Israel like Chuck Schumer specifically talk about how if Israel doesn't do what the United States wants it to do, i.e. getting rid of Netanyahu, then the U.S. needs to use their aid, all the foreign aid and military aid, as leverage against Israel, which it seems like it seems absurd to me. For months, Biden's been talking about. He's saying Israel needs to do more. The response has been over the top. Israel needs to do more to protect innocent life, protect civilians, and yet pretend like that they need to do more, but not having any teeth to that, not stopping the aid in any way, pretending like the U.S., the most powerful country in the world, by far Israel's biggest supporter, has no power over what Israel does.
I don't want to get too carried away. I still think it's far more likely than not that we'll just get an increase, a slow build towards a crescendo that will never actually get there prior to the election, with leaders like Schumer and Biden and other Democratic figures talking about increasingly frantic terms, talking about how Israel needs to take measures to reduce the human casualties and the destruction, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the intention is to just be able to escalate slowly enough to get Biden across the finish line. And if Biden's reelected, then the blank check for Israel will absolutely remain without restrictions for the indefinite future. And I think that's what they want to have happen. I think that's what AIPAC would prefer have happen. I think that's what the ADL would like. But Trump he's got pretty good political instincts. And he here recently, after largely staying out of the national conversation in the U.S. about Israel and Hamas, showed recently that he was very much in favor of Israel. He signaled by encouraging Israel to, quote, finish the job, unquote, that he is on board unequivocally, and there is no waffling from him. And I think he's realizing what an opportunity politically he has here if he becomes the figure that is most supportive of Israel and will continue to allow Israel to do whatever it needs to do.
And I heard recently some people on the I would call it the anti-war right or anti-war libertarian side who seem puzzled that Trump would take this aggressive stance. They seem to think that it would be like, why wouldn't Trump just embrace the America First approach and say, of course we're not gonna support this foreign country. We're America First.
Well, look, that's where my sympathies lie. But the reality is that politically, those people, the libertarian right, is effectively clueless. When you have these podcasts that have a couple 100,000 people listen to them out of a country of 330 million people, and they think that the arguments that they put forward and that their supporters agree with are going to somehow move the needle at a national level, and that just isn't the case at all. Trump's path to victory is not being more truly an advocate for America First. His potential path for victory in 2024 is to jujitsu the establishment into being on his side. And on the question of Israel, it's not just the establishment that's on Trump's side. While there is a lot of noise being made by some of the undecided or the uncommitted campaign among Democratic primary voters to symbolically show their frustration with the Biden administration for not doing more to put pressure on Israel and to help the Palestinians, the reality is that the public sympathy, public support in the conflict in the United States still is on net pro-Israel. From polling just a couple of days ago on whether Americans have more sympathy, more support for the Israelis or for the Palestinians, the overall population, it's 32% with the Israelis, just 17% with the Palestinians, and the residual, which is another almost 50%, either saying they're not sure or both equally. So among those who express a strong opinion one way or the other, it's a 2-to-1 advantage for Israel. Among Democrats, it's split almost evenly with a modest affinity for the Palestinians, with 19% of Democrats saying that they sympathize more with the Israelis and 25% of Democrats saying they sympathize more with the Palestinians. But among Republicans, it's 55% saying that they sympathize more with the Israelis and just 6% with Palestinians. And among independents, 24% sympathizing more with the Israelis and 19% sympathizing more with the Palestinians. So not just the establishment position, which is probably even more lopsided than the general public sentiment is, but also among the general public, support for Israel is more popular than support for the Palestinians. And viewed with that in mind, it's not surprising, or it shouldn't be surprising, that the populist candidate, Donald Trump, is pivoting into a position where he's able to take advantage of a position that is more popular both among the general public and also among the power centers and the establishment than what his political opposition feels like it's being forced into supporting. That libertarians that can't get 5% of the national vote are unable to understand that is not especially surprising.
I think there is more power in the uncommitted movement, perhaps, than Ness does. I've listened to, again, maybe it's just a bias of what I listen to, but there seems to be real, genuine anger among a lot of the grassroots of the Democratic Party, to the extent that while I certainly don't think they're going to be voting for Trump in November, I do think there's enough of them who will just stay home and not vote. That, again, when we're talking about a handful of battleground states, specifically Michigan, I think is with the large Muslim American population, I think that could be enough to tip the balance. So I think that accounts for why you see people like Chuck Schumer coming out against Netanyahu and Biden at least ratcheting up at least the rhetoric against Israel and in favor of the Palestinians and how Israel needs to do more to minimize casualties.
Well, the Arab population in Michigan is barely over 1%. So if the margin of error is less than 1%, then that might be a plausible explanation. But as you say there, as you alluded to there, the percentages of people who are disaffected from Biden voting for Trump is infinitesimally small. And so there is no drawback at all for Trump from really leaning into the pro-Israeli position, unfortunately, even though rhetorically that goes against the America First agenda. Effectively, as we laid out before, being able to marry populist sentiment among the electorate with what the power structure desires is a huge coup for Trump's chances in November.
And I think among America First people, a lot of them anyway, Israel is basically the 51st state. I mean, that's the only way to really understand how they can at the same time say America First, but have no issue giving billions of dollars of aid to Israel. And the other thing I should say, it's not just the Muslim Americans who are very fired up about this issue. To use a bad pun, people like Bushnell, Aaron Bushnell, the Air Force officer who literally burned himself to death because he was so appalled at what was happening in Palestine. I don't think he's alone. I mean, obviously, most people are not going to go to that extreme, but that emotion he felt is real, and it's not limited just to Muslim Americans. That's why I think it could have a big impact.
It might not be limited to Muslim Americans, but I think the reality is that it ports pretty well onto anti-white sentiment in general. If you look at support for the Palestinians and support for DEI and the anti-white systemic structure that is increasingly taking over in the West, they are virtually identical. So support for the Palestinian cause is much higher among self-described leftists, among younger people, among blacks, among academics, etc. And so I don't think that the America First contingent is incorrect, even if they can't articulate why, in their intuition that support for Israel is a sort of implicit support for their own, sort of an implicit support for middle America, traditional America, conventional America, middle-class white America, however you want to phrase it, and that support for the Palestinians in opposition to Israel is effectively a proxy for anti-white, anti-colonialist, cultural revolution in the West.
That's certainly a part of it. I think, in my opinion, a bigger factor is the strong evangelical support for Israel. So while there is that implicit proxy that you were talking about, Ness, I think more is the explicit religious component to this. That explains much of Middle America's support for Israel.
I don't know. There is a lot of evangelical support among evangelical pastors, prominent figures in the evangelical movement in support of Israel, but I don't know that it's any more supportive of Israel than, say, Chuck Schumer or Joe Biden. And I think the evangelicals correctly assess that those who are opposed to Israel also are opposed to the evangelicals in Middle America and probably hate them as much, or if not more, than they do the settlers in Israel. And it's not because the evangelicals support Israel. That's not why they're hated. They're hated because they are middle American white evangelicals. Staying on the presidential election, but looking at it from a different angle, candidate enthusiasm. There is a big edge that Trump has currently in terms of the enthusiasm of his supporters relative to those of Joe Biden. Polling from this week asked voters whether or not they were enthusiastically supportive of their candidate, and among Biden voters, there are those who intend to vote for Biden in November. Just 44% report being enthusiastic about his candidacy. Among Trump supporters, in contrast, it's 66%. So that is exactly a 50% higher rate of enthusiasm among Trump supporters than among Biden supporters. And that's in a poll where an absolute number, or Trump has a higher absolute number of poll respondents supporting him. So it's one of, like most of the national polls that are being conducted now, has Trump with a slight edge in terms of the overall vote if the vote was held today. And then on top of that, there's additionally a 50% enthusiasm premium or edge for Trump relative to Biden. So assuming that the 2024 election is on the up and up, and the votes that are cast are the votes that are counted, this adds another bit of evidence that makes it interesting to see how the assertion that Trump will not be permitted to retake the presidency in 2024, how that's going to be squared with the reality of what the polls seem to show at this point in time.
That enthusiasm gap you mentioned, that makes intuitive sense to me. The enthusiasm among Trump supporters seems to be primarily they are excited to vote for Trump. versus there's a lot of people who are supportive of Biden, and they're motivated less by support for Biden and more by hatred for Trump. And the Democrats seem to be running the same or a similar fear campaign about how if we let Trump get into office, he's going to be a dictator. But that seems like, while that could have been a plausible argument back in 2015, 2016, we now have 4 years of Trump being president, and very few, if any, of these hysterical things that they said were going to happen happens.
Yeah, the histrionics, the warnings about what would happen if Trump assumed the presidency in 2015, 2016, while those were seemed unlikely at the time, they were at least plausible. Whereas now, with 4 years of evidence and the intervening 4 years in between, it's quite clear that, quite contrary to being a sort of authoritarian dictator, Trump is perhaps less likely to wield the power of the executive branch than any president in modern history, probably than any president in since the 19th century, with maybe the exception of Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah, or Warren Harding.
The fact that we have to go back over a century to get a once in a lifetime occurrence in the direction not of being authoritarian or being dictatorial, but being the opposite of that, really deflates the enthusiasm, the amount of visceral opposition to Trump that can be ginned up. And I think that manifests itself in the pretty paltry levels of enthusiasm among those who express intent to vote for Biden in November.
They do have January 6th, though, January 6th, 2021, the, quote, insurrection. I think that's their best rhetorical point for the Democrats to keep bringing up. That they say, look how close the democracy barely held. It was on the ropes, but our institutions held against would-be dictator. And if we give him another chance, then who knows what could happen. It could be January 6th times 10.
Yeah, that relies on absolutely no investigation into the video footage that has come out, or the utter implausibility of people going in unarmed to the Capitol and taking selfies and being led around by the police. The idea that they were a serious threat or that they had any intention of insurrection or anything else, it requires that to be believed. That being said, if the institutions of power state that is what is to be believed, that is to a large extent what will be believed. It's just the question of how much motivation it will provide.
I saw a funny meme the other day. It was a picture of the January 6th committee, and underneath it said, nominated for Best Film Editing, Oscar.
And the last thing I'd like to hit on is a bit of a conundrum at this point to me, and that is that polling that includes third-party candidates, primarily RFK, who takes the lion's share of the third-party vote in hypothetical polls. Those polls that show more than just Biden versus Trump tend to show Trump's advantage expand with the addition of other candidates. So when Jill Stein and RFK and Cornel West, Trump's advantage is even larger than it is over Biden when it's just Trump versus Biden. And yet, at the same time, RFK is a lot more popular among Trump supporters than he is among Biden supporters. So from, again, the same poll that we've been referencing a couple times here that was conducted this week, we see just 29% of Biden voters having a favorable view of Robert Kennedy, while 61% of Trump voters have a favorable view of RFK. And yet, even though Trump voters are more than twice as likely to have a favorable opinion of RFK than Biden voters are, RFK seems to steal more votes in these hypothetical polls, or at least not fewer votes from Biden than he does from Trump. So I'm not sure exactly how to square that circle. I guess I could come up with a just so explanation in that we kind of to tie it into the enthusiasm gap, that while Trump supporters are more favorably inclined towards RFK as a person, they are very much in on Trump. And so even though a lot of them like RFK, none of them are going to abandon Trump for RFK. Whereas while there's a smaller pool of intended Biden voters who are favorably inclined towards RFK than there is among Trump voters, among that smaller contingent, there is a higher likelihood to peel off from Biden because there is so much less enthusiasm for Biden than there is for Trump. So in short, while Trump supporters like RFK more than Biden voters do, Trump supporters really like Trump, and Biden voters don't like Biden so much. And so they are potentially more open to going third party than Trump voters are.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Talk to you next time.